This is a cell, any cell. It has multiple functions based on the proteins that are embedded in the membrane. So some proteins are receptors for chemical signal information. That's number one on this slide. Some of the proteins are required in the case of, say, an amoeboid cell in order to get movement and enlargement of a cell in order to change its shape. So, for example, a phagocyte will change its shape as it engulfs a bacterium in your bloodstream. And then there are all these proteins which are involved in either import or export of molecules. Here, in this kind of cell, you might expect to find such proteins pretty well evenly diffused around the surface of the cell membrane. But now, as it says down below, different regions of the cell membrane can have different functions, including recognizing molecules on the external environment. They can recognize other cells, and if they do that, they can know which cells to associate with to form tissues. This is two half cells and one whole cell of an epithelial layer that might line your gut, for example, or line your blood vessels. Such epithelial cells are actually divided into membrane domains so that certain proteins are found only in one region of the membrane and other proteins in other regions. Proteins that are on the apical side of the epithelial layer interact with circulating hormones and nutrients. Proteins on the cell surface on that side would be designed to recognize hormones or recognize nutrients and know to bind them and take them up. The membranes of adjacent cells in this layer would have different proteins that are there to enable the cells to communicate or to stick together, as in the example of this thing called a tight junction. Proteins participate in actually holding cells together, and obviously that's a domain of membranes as well. And finally, on the bottom side, the cells of an epithelial layer are actually attached to something, generically called the basal lamina, and obviously different proteins are required to effect that attachment. So, different proteins in membranes can be confined to different regions, in part by how the cells interact with one another and create barriers to the movement of these proteins. So a tight junction, for example, is a barrier to the movement of the proteins here, in this case called proteins A and B. A is on the apical surface and can't get into the middle, the lateral plasma membrane as it's called here, and those proteins B, which are on the lateral plasma membrane surface, likewise can't find themselves up in the apical surface. So the right proteins are placed in the right location on membranes.